welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your sparkly, shiny shoe host, Madelyn.
I'm your dirty, grimy host, Emma.
And thanks for tuning into this week's episode. It's side quest time, and Emma's kicking off a regional series for us at Talk This, where we'll be talking about game studios from different countries and the work that they do. So this week, CD Projekt Red, Bloober, Orbital Night, a lot of like smaller indie studios. That's right, for Polish in games.
Very funny, Melon.
I truly, when you texted me, that was how I read it. I read it as Polish. And I understood what it meant right away. I was not fooled into thinking you were saying the word Polish, but I did read it out loud in my head.
Polish.
That way. Yeah.
I did, Malin posted a few different, Reddit threads about Polish in games, and I swear all of them had at least one joke that was like, oh, the game's from Poland.
I saw it too. I'm not claiming this to be an original joke. I'm just genuinely recounting that I did read it as Polish.
Okay.
When you sent it.
But no, we're digging up some, month, 3-week-old discourse at this point to talk about polish in video games. What does it mean for a game to be polished? And why do we care so much about it right now?
What do you mean, why do we care so much about it, Emma? Consumers can demand a quality product.
They sure can. So this conversation sort of happened around the release of Baldur's Gate 3 on PC, which is very funny for reasons, but we'll get to that. Where, Baldur's Gate 3 is a really huge, expansive, what is it?
CRPG?
CRPG, where, you go around, there's lots of different impacts of things. It's based on D&D. It's got combat, it's got conversation, it's got dice rolls, it's got everything you could ever want in a game. It's got no microtransactions. It's a complete game that's hundreds of hours long. Nobody gets the same experience, right? And around this, there was some discussion of why aren't all games like this? Why aren't all games 100 hours, huge narrative experiences? Nobody who says this is actually a serious person. But there were a few Twitter threads from game developers just laying out that, in a lot of ways, a games like Baldur's Gate 3 is impossible for developers, especially if you're going for a more indie team. You should probably not be aiming to make a Baldur's Gate 3.
Yeah.
In response to that, IGN made a video taking a lot of these tweets out of context, being why not? All these buggy games coming out recently, all these unfinished games. Why can't I demand, things like Baldur's Gate 3? Why doesn't everything come out and be like Baldur's Gate 3? Why aren't all games as polished as this game is?
It truly feels like this man hijacked IGN.
No, apparently he's a regular. He's their lead of video content or something.
But watching it, I was like, who is this guy? How did they, IGN is the game site. And how on earth, whatever. I'm sure they're making unbelievable amount of money on this video, right?
I don't think you make that much money off videos, period. Actually,
fair enough. But in the context of money that a single video can make for a site in terms of generating clicks.
It's getting a lot of views. Yes,
yeah.
I'm sure.
So in that sense, I suppose that it has accomplished the mission of video content in 2023. But it was watching it, I was just shocked as he kept talking on this site that is the video games site. Over and over saying he doesn't know anything about how games are developed. And it's who gave you the microphone?
Also, you could figure it out. You've got the name, you could do some questions, ask some people.
You actually don't even have to figure it out. You can just say, what industry do I know anything about? Because literally any arts or arts adjacent industry that you look at right now is battling with issues of like scope creep and like things coming out sort of unfinished. And it's not like exactly the same as games, but like I see a lot of parallels to theater in this because I do theater. And I'm sure if you work in television or you work in film or you work in music or whatever, there's a lot of things here that are there are going to be parallels to.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, maybe if you just think a little bit about like the economy, you might like, okay, I don't want to spend too much time talking about this video because it's like stupid, right?
Yeah.
But I loved in it where he says in this video, oh my gosh, I'm trying to find the quote. Sorry, I have so many notes about this stupid video. This being like, this man is so dumb. Yelling man is so dumb. If I search yell in my notes, will I find it? Yes. So he says, it feels like money has become more important than the core experience for fans, like in reference to developers. And it's like, you are so close here, buddy. You almost got it. Just keep going.
Yeah. But yeah, so sort of what I wanted to talk about, like jumping off that discussion, is like, what does it even mean for a game to be polished? What does it actually mean versus like how do people are using the word polish? They've learned the word, the Twitterers, the Xers, they've learned the word polish now. And they will use it. And like, why aren't all games? Why do not all games not come out polished? Because the like, what does polished actually mean versus like how do people use it is an interesting question, because like this is like the least important point, but Baldur's Gate 3 is not what I would call a polished game. I don't think.
In some ways. In many ways it is.
Well, in many ways it's very impressive. It is doing so much behind the hood. It is very smart. It's got cool design stuff going on, but it is super not what I would... It's not even the bugs, of which there were many bugs in the PC port, and in the console port. But, like, the inventory system sucks. Like, I've started playing this on the console port. I'm having a lot of fun. I hate the inventory system sucks so bad. So hard. Like, that's one thing. It's like, they didn't... I don't feel like they didn't spend any time on this at all. You know?
It's fair. And, you know, it always comes down to, like, what does a given person care about? But yeah, I mean... Go ahead.
I mean, you put this article of, like, what do we mean when we say polished? And I do think a lot of people just are using it because it sounds smarter, to just say this game's good, right? Not necessarily to say this game is polished, which I don't think those are the same thing all of the time.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the time are using it to mean, like, I felt immersed in this game, right?
Yeah.
Because polish does, you know, I think if we all sat down and we were going to say, like, what's an academic definition of polished? And this might not be the correct definition, right? But we were going to get down and be like, okay, like, technically, what should this mean if I was going to write, like, a dictionary entry that didn't need me to explain, like, vibes to it, right? Which is that, like, the game comes out and, like, it works, right? It looks good. There aren't too many bugs. The frame rate makes frame rate people happy, right? It's got some kind of a system that is, like, complex but works, right? So polish is like, I'm not encountering things that are reminding me that I'm playing a software, like that I'm running a software program in front of me right now. I'm having an experience.
I did read, there was a game developer article where they talked to a lot of developers about like what they would define as polish, which for a lot of like for game development, it's like sort of the last part of the process that you do. You spend a time in polish, fixing the things that will just make things smoother and better. So in some ways, it's not a game is functional. It's that a game is a step beyond functional, is what a polished game is, to me.
I agree, but I think as we'll talk about, I think the standard that games come out in now is meaning that the step beyond functional often sort of is more like, actually, it's functional.
Yeah, that's fair.
Which is a little bit circular, but it hopefully makes sense. Right? Like, I'm not a PC gamer, and do PC gamers get what they deserve for being on PC? Maybe. But, like, if you played a game on PC, like, you probably understand, right? That, like, the game probably comes to you and it's not so great in terms of some way of it runs. And
yes,
if it runs...
this year has had a very large amount of high-profile, poor PC releases.
So now if you come and you release a game that, like, runs on the PC, that's going to come across as like, oh, this game is polished, because that's sort of where the expectation level is right now. The word polish is such an interesting choice for it from the developer side perspective, because I can see from the sort of like consumer or analysis side of saying, oh, the polish is that, yeah, it runs like a little better than it should, or like there's something that like, that's crazy that works, right?
Sure.
And like we'll talk about Tears of the Kingdom plenty, and like Nintendo plenty, right? But that was the earlier discourse on polish this year, right? Was Tears of the Kingdom's like unbelievable kind of building, construction, physics stuff.
Yes.
And everyone being like, how do they do this? It's so bug free, yada yada yada. And so, like, in that case, I can say, yes, like, that's polish, because that's the kind of thing that could come out and be kind of janky, and no one would blame you, really. I mean, people would blame you, but no one would really blame you. Everyone would be like, oh, that's hard.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to me that it's, like, something that is a part of the process from the development side, and it's a word that referred to...
It's something that should be part of the process.
You're right.
That's the key word.
Thank you. But it's an interesting word to use, and like unfortunate fuel to the fire of some of the like games that are released unfinished. Because when I think of polishing in the context of like not games, I think of a butler polishing silver I just read Remains of the Day, so like that's on my mind. Like I think of a butler like polishing silver in a house, or I think of somebody getting like their shoes shined, or like polishing jewelry or something that's like extra.
Yeah.
But I don't think that the polishing process on the development side, the way it's described by some of these developers, feels like it should be extra. It's like what you're describing is QA.
Well, it's not. The polish is not for game breaking bugs.
Right.
They don't leave the hole in your shoe, for example.
Yeah, but that's not what you do. That's not what a shoe polisher does. Okay. It's not. They're not cobbling. You're right.
Sure. They don't. Okay, they don't not wash the dish. How about that?
Yeah.
So in a lot, the polish is more like, oh, this, and it means things for different departments. One of the things put this out of like, oh, this could be prettier, and we can do that. Or this feels not quite fun enough. We could make this a little more fun. Or this could load a little faster. Is more what polish is. So I do think you get to a state where you can ship it, and then you have polish to make it good, or to make it more pretty in various ways, not just in a visual sense, but in everything.
Right, but that's where I feel like, and I think that's what we're talking about here, that some of the ways of talking about this come apart. I feel like so much of polish in how we talk about it, like it often has a connotation about being about bugs, right? And about there being not very many bugs. And like that sort of polish of saying, how can I make the game a little better? Yeah, it has something to do with like, how can I get rid of these not game breaking, but something bugs? But it's so much more than that. Whereas polish in current discourse very much is like, it doesn't have microtransactions. The bugs.
Yes.
I am not noticing the bugs. That's funny.
Yes. The funniest bug for my Baldur's 3 playthrough right now is occasionally one of my companions who's not in my party will approve of the things that I'm doing all the way from camp. So I imagine he just like goes into the center of camp and is like, thumbs up, Simone! And that's how I hear it, you know, from wherever he is.
Have you considered it's not a game bug, but in fact an in-universe bug?
That he's bugged me?
Yeah.
It's possible. It's possible.
You're gonna have to come back and apologize to Larian in the 6-week podcast. And you'll be like, I said this was a bug, but this guy, like, he actually has a magical D&D bug spell on me.
It was very funny because I progressed his storyline and he, like, lists off the things you've done where he trusts you. And it was like, you were not there for 2/3 of these.
He heard
Gail,
about it, okay?
How do you know?
Some people text their friends. Okay.
You're right.
No, but as Emma alluded to before, and as I'm sure we will talk about plenty, game development is hard and is only getting harder, and timelines for game development are only getting more challenging for everyone for all reasons, because games are harder and more complex to develop, because there's more financial expectations and more capitalism, or crunchier, crushinger capitalism than there were, you know, it only gets worse. And so polish becomes something that, I mean, you know, it gets more at the heart of the name, which is like, well, if we don't get as much polish time, that's going to be the first thing to go.
So, just to break down some common examples that get brought up for games that are really polished or complete or whatever. Like, we've been talking about Baldur's Gate 3, which sort of is what served as like a trigger for this short conversation happening on social media or whatever. Baldur's Gate 3 was in early access for like 3 years more, where they, you know, they sold it incomplete. You could only play Act 1, full of bugs, not, you know, all sorts of things changing all the time, and they sold it at full price. And people do this in early access in order to get some influx of budget, of money to use to continue development. So it gets in like the interest, and it's an easy way to get a lot of playtesters, essentially. And in something like Baldur's Gate 3, for your game like that, there are going to be bugs that you probably aren't going to get until you've got like thousands of permutations, thousands of players going through the game and doing very specific. So there's that. There are also a point I saw commonly brought up is that they're privately owned. They're not traded. They don't have boardroom people. They don't have investors. They just have the one guy who's CEO.
And notably, the one guy who's CEO is also like the director. So it's not a situation where it's like, we've got one guy CEO. I mean, it sort of is, but it's not a situation where we have one guy CEO and like, we have to make sure we make a game that Mr. Moneybags likes.
Yes.
It is that, but Mr. Moneybags is making the game.
It, yes.
So, yeah.
There's also the point of, this is just the type of game that Larian makes. They've made like 2 previous games like this, plus definitive editions for both those games. They're building off a lot of existing tech that they've had and built over years that they understand really well and can apply to this. They've built expertise in this genre, right? Then you have Nintendo, which just
one other thing for them.
Yeah.
And I want to call out me having heard this on Remap and being like, oh yes, that makes sense. On top of Larian also having made this type of game for forever, they're also building off of a Dungeons and Dragons system that has been refined for decades.
Yes, that too. Yes, this one's based on the latest Dungeons and Dragons system as well. So they are also taking that and just adjusting it for their purposes, essentially. Then you have Nintendo. You can say, like, again, like the expertise, they make the same sorts of games and just evolve it, right? So they're a company that have made these types of games for a while.
And they have literally the same people making them.
Yes. Yeah. They have huge amounts of money. All their first party games go towards selling their own proprietary console as well. So when they're selling Tears of the Kingdom, they're also selling Switches, which helps.
And also incentivizes them to not make something where people are like,
yeah,
the Switch sucks.
Yes. And they just, like I said, they have so much money and confidence and name recognition that they can say, like, okay, we're going to delay Tears of the Kingdom a year just for our polish section, like our polish development. Which is an insane thing that I don't think any other developer could do, honestly.
It's fascinating, too, because, like, and I say this mostly understanding, but, like, if I'm Nintendo and all I want to do is make a ton of money, like why? You'll probably sell almost the same amount of games if you release the game polished or not polished.
But their brand is so important.
I know.
So they have to keep that brand. That brand is what lets them sell as much as that they do, what keeps them loyal customers, and why that's probably partially why they are so harsh on people, like, you know, uploading ROMs or whatever, is because they're so obsessed with their brand that they don't want anyone to be touching that or be marring that in any way, even if that does make them look bad in a different way.
It does make games like Animal Crossing, though, that much more little fascinating little blips, doesn't it?
I mean, Animal Crossing was polished.
Well, but maybe it pulls apart some of the different ways people talk about polished, right? You talk about polished and complete being things that feel together, and I feel like, well, Animal Crossing for sure polished. Like there are a lot of like, is this complete? This isn't complete. Just many strands.
Yeah.
But yes, but it's fascinating to think about, like, you know, at many other companies who could feel as sure of their sales as Nintendo, it's like, well, whatever, like, we'll patch it. Tears of the Kingdom is going to sell pretty much the same amount of games now as it will in a year. It doesn't matter. Like, people are going to buy it. But they definitely have a long, like you said, like a long-term investment of, okay, as many, like, millions of people are going to buy Tears of the Kingdom no matter what now, but, like, will they buy the Zelda game that we release, you know, 3 more in the series from now, if we've degraded that? And that's, you have to have a lot of money to be thinking about your series reputation in a decade.
And then the last one I see brought up the most is From Software, which is, I think, the most complicated one. Mm-hmm. But again, I think comes down to expertise. They have just been making these games. This is the game that they make. You know, they take, there's assets, they bring them forward. There's stuff from previous games in Elden Ring. They bring all of their sort of expertise forward and just apply it to a different story, different world, few different bosses, whatever. And also, they have built a reputation among fans. They have a certain amount of clout to be able to do what they want to a certain extent. And because their name is so strong that, you know, they're able to leverage that fact to them. And that's what's allowed them, I think, to make Armored Core 6, for example, which is not a Souls game, is a different type of game, although they've made that before as well. But being able to put that out is partly due to that fact that they've built themselves such a reputation.
And so all of those things be like self-reinforcing things, right? As we see here, it's studios that already have a fair bit of money, whether that's because they're Nintendo and they have more money than God. They're From Software in that, like, their most recent few games have gone crazy, mm-hmm. right? Or you're privately wealthy and mm-hmm. Well, you're using early access to funnel some more money into it, but also you don't have shareholders who are trying to extract it. Like, you have somebody who is doing this to make a lot of money, but also because he likes directing games, right?
Yeah.
And wants to make specific kinds of games. So like having money, right? Which allows you to have more time, but also being able to have more time because you aren't literally starting from scratch, right?
Yep.
So you aren't you have the expertise enough to figure literally everything out, and also you have the expertise such that probably you've created fewer horrifying bugs for yourself in the first place, or you've used that expertise to make a game that is bigger and has the same number of horrifying bugs that a smaller game would have, or something like that.
Yeah.
And then that recognizable sort of brand thing, right? And you know, and that's really comes back to money too, right? Like Nintendo knows people are going to buy their games. From Software knows people are going to buy their games now on a different scale, perhaps post Elden Ring, but even then, knew people were going to buy their games. Baldur's Gate 3 maybe is the wild card of the bunch, but like there was obviously momentum building behind that, and like Dungeons and Dragons, believe it or not, kind of hot right now.
Yes.
So like all of these things could feel pretty certain of making at least some money. So it's all money. It's all money. There's some time element in there, but the time itself is also kind of money.
Yes. It's also, I think about, like, something I wrote in here is that the existence of being able to patch your game after the fact does encourage more ambitious game design, I think, in the modern era. So if you're like, oh, the good old, this isn't true anyway, but games always had bugs, but all the good old days when they didn't have bugs is possibly because they were simpler games that didn't have as many, like, gajillion moving parts under the hood. If something like Baldur's Gate 3 shipped and genuinely did not have a single bug, I simply do not believe that something like that is possible, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, anything not having any, like, what could you even create that didn't have a bug, frankly? Like, how simple, like, surely, does Tetris have bugs? Probably.
Well, I don't know.
If you messed around with it enough, probably.
I guess so.
I don't know. But I did wonder as I was reading this, because, you know, like, I read all these things that was like the Baldur's Gate CEO, right? He's, like, they launch on PC to, like, almost 1 million people playing it at once, right? Which is just a wild thing to, like, think about happening to anything that you've ever done.
Yes.
He says, what's he thinking about? He's like, I hope there aren't any really bad bugs. That's what he's thinking about. And I just want to think, like, okay, like, did the folks at Square Enix feel that way when they launched Final Fantasy VII? You know, or like were they just like, the game's over, thank God?
Well, something like Final Fantasy VII Remake, like they did release, you know, their upgraded PS5 version, but it did not get a patch before that. I don't think, at least not a major one, because stuff like the door texture, the infamous door texture, that was just they didn't bother. Yeah. Right. Which is also interesting to think about, because a lot of game developers, you know, you see Larian being like, here's 1,000 fixes in like the week after release, you know, and like, oh, we heard the fans talking about they don't like this one character's epilogue, so we added a little bit to it, you know, and they're very much like hopping on the bugs they get. And then there's some developers like Square Enix, they're just like,
whatever.
It's a good game. Who cares if the door looks like crap? You can get your free PS5 upgrade in 2 years or whatever.
Yeah. No, in this whole thing, because you're right. I mean, so much of this and the discourse around, I mean, it's hard to judge how the discourse around it has changed, because, of course, the patch era of games also coincides with, like, the Twitter era, right? So it's hard to judge from my perspective sitting here in 2023 as someone who is not old enough to really be participating in any games discourse pre-social media, right?
Yes.
To judge, like, oh, like, were people whining about games being released incomplete in, like, the year 2000?
Yeah.
I have to think probably not, or mostly not anyway, but I don't know. But it makes me also think like, oh, now like developers just have to, when the game comes out, they'd just be like sitting by their computer, right? Being like, okay, time to start patching out the bajillion things that people found that were broken, right? Or like more likely keep working on the things that we already knew were broken, but we didn't have time to fix.
Yeah.
And like in 2000, did they just get to go get a drink?
I mean, nothing they could do.
That's not totally true. I was reading about, like, they would release, like, I mean, there's nothing they could do for players who currently have it, but, like, for instance, like, the first generation Pokemon games are really very glitchy, right? And they can't fix all of that, but some of the glitches in, like, Pokemon Yellow, well, Pokemon Yellow just fixed some of them, because Pokemon Yellow is kind of, like, a patch in itself, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right? But, like, they released just, like, new versions of the cartridges that fixed things, like stealth patches, basically. Obviously, that doesn't fix anyone who already has the game. It doesn't, like, inject into the cartridge.
But, I mean, that's something that modern games have over, like, all other forms of media. If you buy a book... I guess they can update if you buy a digital copy now, maybe. But if you buy a physical book and it's like the first print and it has some misprints in it, buy again.
Yeah.
Or if you get a DVD and it's busted.
Nobody buys DVDs anymore, Emma.
Some people do. Okay.
But see, I wanted to point this out, that television and movies are a little, I mean, you know, we all know the Han shot first stuff, right?
Right.
Or my favorite Netflix note on Community. One episode of season 2 is not available.
Yeah. Good summary.
It's a great summary of the show. It does give you the information you need to know.
It does.
So they're starting to be like, and not starting to be, I mean, obviously Star Wars is decades old, right? But there's some quote-unquote patching that happens in like recorded media.
Oh yeah. This is a little bit off topic, but I remember there being like a story of like, oh, like whatever the second Spider-Verse is called, I can't remember which one is which.
Across
of like
the Spider-Verse.
Across the Spider-Verse.
You go into it, and then you go across.
And then you go across it, and then you go beyond it. Got it. I understand. And, like, they're like, oh, there's, like, 2 different cuts. Like, a couple of the cuts are different.
Oh, except there's, like,
at different movie theaters.
Cuts, right? I feel like that's what I was eventually seeing. Anyway.
But even regardless, and then, like, it was, like, at the same time the story had come out of, like, they can't edit it until you animate it. They want to see, like, a complete animation before they'll give you notes on it. Oh my god, horrifying. And it's just, like, is that... people on social media are like, oh yeah, it's like, you know, Spider-Verse is like different. It's like, is it, or were they just fixing it after they sent some of them out to theaters? It's hard to say.
That hadn't occurred to me, and what a horrible thought.
Yeah. So there's that sort of stuff as well, I guess.
But yeah, I mean, but the existence of patches and the ease of being able to patch things, and even just the existence of digital games. I can't remember what game I was reading about. I feel like it was something you had posted. I can't remember what it was, but I was reading something that was like, oh, like the fact. Oh, it was oh my god, why can't I remember the name of this? It's the Control Studio, but it's their other one.
Remedy, Alan Wake.
I think it was Alan Wake.
Quantum Break is like their other one, I think, maybe.
I'm pretty sure it was the Alan Wake remake.
Oh, the Alan Wake 2.
I don't know. Whatever. Something
they're doing Alan Wake 2 is digital only.
Yes, perfect. You got me there. It does not really matter. I was just fighting really hard to remember what it was. But they talked about how it's like, oh, releasing it digital only gives us like 3 extra weeks because we don't have to print it.
Yeah.
So just all of that, the whole digital distribution model has made it possible to work on games much more like right down to the wire, and probably bet on finishing more, or have your bosses bet on you finishing more than you could possibly finish in that amount of time. And, does certainly lead to games releasing less polished. But that's also because games are like 10 billion times more complicated than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, probably even 5 years ago. So, like, that's just the way it is.
It's the key to polish, which I saw again in this game developer article with all these different developers, is like having a good schedule. Like building it into the schedule. You've got like the polish time, and shouldn't be the same as your buffer time, right? Your buffer time is not your polish time. You should have polish time and buffer time was one key thing I saw people saying. But it's hard to make a schedule for a year's worth of project, right? It cannot be possible to make a schedule for like 5 years of project that will be correct throughout those 5 years.
Well, and like, for instance, so I was just reading, and I think this came out in the Washington Post just yesterday, like an interview with Todd Howard about Starfield, which was originally supposed to come out in November 2022. And he says in this article, like, when we picked that release date, we had lots of buffer, we felt really good about it. And then he says, as things moved on, we were off by a percentage, and a percentage when it comes to the scale of this game turns out to be a lot of time. And what he doesn't say in that specific quote is that, like, within that period was, like, the global pandemic. Mm-hmm. Which, believe it or not, is probably going to eat into your buffer.
Yes. You can put in, it's very funny to think about, like, even if you put in the buffer, but the buffer did not cover the global pandemic.
Yeah.
Especially, like, that's probably fine if you're, like, a team of 3 indies working remotely anyway, but, like, for a game like Starfield, that's going to have a huge impact on the work that people can do on the game.
So that's obviously sort of like the nightmare scenario of your 5-year plan, but in any 5-year plan, I mean, in a game that size, if you're off by, like, 1% of how long you think it's going to take, or even just how long some portion of it is going to take, then that throws off your entire timeline. And you think you can estimate how long something's going to take you down to like 1/10%?
Yep. And in doing that, if your shareholders or boardroom members or Todd Howard or whoever cannot push it back, like will only push it back so far, or won't push it back, or whatever their money needs are, a lot of times what will come out of that is, by necessity, any polish time, because you have to make it functional first. I mean, maybe you're doing some polish during the development, of course. You aren't just like slapdashing things in there and then we're like, then let's apply the textures in the last 2 weeks or whatever. Maybe you are. That doesn't seem like a good way to do it, but maybe you are. But this time that it takes to make, like, add little things and add little flourishes and whatever, that's what gets lost, because the game has to function primarily. And so your resources are going to go to that, and you just aren't going to have time to do the polish until, like, after release.
And, I mean, what I will say to bring it back to yelling IGN man, is he's not wrong that if there was like a mass uprising of gamers who said, oh god, sorry,
don't speak that into the world though.
Sorry, but I mean, okay, I don't think this would be like an entirely negative thing. Like if there was like a big, like, everyone putting their foot down and saying no, like I won't buy a game that's buggy like this at release. Right? Like, okay, day 1 patch. Of course. Like, you have to get in a few last minute fixes. Fine. But if the whole consumer base said, I won't stand for this, I won't tolerate this, then there probably would have to be changes in the, like, capitalist model of this. Sure. But that won't happen, and it can't happen because the only way you discover if a game is that buggy is that amount of people playing it.
Yeah. Well, I would say there's a couple of different things of stopping the gamer uprising. Of pre-ordering is pretty much baked into video game culture.
Yep.
For better or mostly for worse. I do it. I pre-order games. I'm part of the problem. I admit it. I'm sorry.
They're gonna get me with Gaiden. I can't believe that they're gonna do it. I just want to be able to play as Majima. I'm gonna be abroad when it comes out. I'm not even gonna play it day one.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna play it for weeks minimum.
Two, a lot of the people who would be interested in Uprising have a deep invested dislike of reviews. Amazing, like, the Cyberpunk is such an amazing little case study of, like, reviews came out and they were like 7s and people were furious.
Yeah.
Without even touching the game. And then it came out and it was like they were then furious at the devs.
And, like, furious at the 7s, right?
And
like,
then first still furious at the 7s.
First they were furious at the 7s because they were too low, and then it was like misleading. Everything was misleading.
Yeah, so there's the problem of gamers don't trust reviews for mostly bad reasons. And I feel like I had another one, but those two are pretty insurmountable, to be honest.
Yeah.
So.
But, like, if that was the point that he was going to try to make, I'd be like, okay, like, sure, that's a point that you can make. That everybody decided that this wasn't something that they would tolerate, that, yeah, these big studios would probably have to find a way to not do that. And
also, well, the last thing that's a sort of side to bugs. Microtransaction is profitable.
Yeah.
It's a profitable model. That's why people keep doing it. Gacha is profitable. Not for every single game, but for the games it works for, it's quite profitable. That's why they keep doing it.
See, that's why I think some of the stuff around Baldur's Gate 3 is a little dystopian. Because it's like, on one hand, oh, look, like, if you have just one guy who owns it and he doesn't want that stuff in his game, then, like, you don't have to have it in the game. But, like, that's awful. That's awful to be like, the ideal model is, like, one guy who you hope is benevolent.
Yeah.
As opposed to, like, shareholders who just want their money. I don't know. Like, I mean, I guess the ideal model is some kind of, like, co-op ownership, but, like, good luck with, I mean, that's kind of what shareholders are supposed to be.
Sure.
Right.
The people making I don't know if it's the same, I think they renamed themselves, I can't remember what it is, but the people making the Night in the Woods follow-up is, like, a worker co-op, I know. So they're out there. They're doing it. They're doing things. If you're looking for polished experiences, may I point you, gamers on the internet, to the vast and thriving indie scene. Behold. Not everything is a terrible AAA PC port.
Oh, let's talk about those. Let's talk about those terrible PC ports. This is a place where it's like, okay. Like, I think people have a right to complain.
Sure, yeah. But it's seems quite hard to develop for PCs and also for consoles in different ways. There's this whole thing of, like, Baldur's Gate 3 is coming to the Xbox Series S, but will not have split screen co-op because my little baby Xbox box is not very powerful.
Wait, Baldur's Gate has local co-op?
It does. It has split screen co-op.
You gotta be kidding me.
Also online co-op, but yes, it has split screen co-op.
Like, my boyfriend was just talking about it. He's like, oh, that seems like my kind of game. Okay. What is up with this? Everyone releasing their split screen co-op games now. Screw you all. Where was that polish 3 years ago? No, I don't mean to say it's not hard. I just mean to say, like, I feel like it's one thing to complain, like, oh no, there are some frame rate drops, like, on my game a little. Or like, oh no, one of the characters his arm is sticking into a wall.
Yeah.
Right? And then to, like, look at some of these PC parts, and it's like, oh, this is bad.
Yeah, so the one thing that is unique about developing for PC is with a console, which is basically just a computer, right?
Like an old computer.
Yes, an
point.
old but also standardized computer. When you develop for the PS5, you know what the person is playing it on. Exactly, right? You know its power, its capabilities, you know what you can do with it. You know what a PS5 is.
Yeah.
You do not know what a PC is. You don't know exactly what... Because so many PC gamers, like, build their own PCs, too, which very cool for them, I think. I feel every time we mention PC gaming, I'm like, I should understand how electronics work so that Apple doesn't own me in the future, or whatever.
Too late.
But one day. And so they might be assembled from a variety of different parts for CPU and GPU and graphics cards and all the sorts of things that go into a PC. And so you have to make sure your game is working and all of those different things. And you can't necessarily optimize it for every single permutation of PC that could be out there. And that's sort of the difficulty of... I don't think that doesn't excuse a lot of the PC ports that have come out, but that is, like, the fundamental difficulty that people have, especially when moving... It seems like it is easier to move from PC to console, scale down what you're doing, than it is to move from console to PC and scale it back up for PC, was at least the impression I got from the articles I read on it.
It was sort of shocking to me to read that, like, a lot of what makes these games bad is just like, well, Unreal is kind of bad at shaders, and there's not really anything we can do. I was like, that feels like something that someone should fix.
I do... Careful, Madelyn, okay? Because the gamers on the internet also learned engines recently. And they do like to say, like, just do it on the good engine, you know? Pick a good engine. Don't do it on the bad engine.
Okay, I hear you, but this issue really did read like, well, someone at Unreal ought to fix that. Like, that seems... So, reading this article, let's get all that out. So, one of the major issues a lot of the time, if you're not a PC gamer, I'm not really a PC gamer, right?
No.
I have a really. Mac. I am playing Kentucky Route Zero slowly on my Mac. It does not have these issues. But a lot of the issue is frame rate and stuttering. And, like, I could not give a crap about frame rate, right? But, like, frame rate, like, stutters. Like, I can't see the difference between frame rates, so that doesn't really bother me. Mostly.
Sure, yeah. It shouldn't be, like... the insistence on 60 is also another problem for developers.
Yeah.
That I've read about, because sometimes it's just, like, it would be fine at 30, but people will get upset if you do that. I think Starfield was like, it's 30, and people got really annoyed at that. It's more of a problem when there are very sudden frame rate drops.
Exactly. And that's what I want to talk about. Or it's not
stable in its frame rate.
Because I can't find it in my heart to do anything but sigh when I hear, like, complaints about, like, oh no, this port is locked at 30 FPS. I'm like, okay. Yeah. My eyes just don't. Like, sorry, I don't have that. My eyes aren't as good as your eyes.
Yes.
Like, sorry.
When they're playing right next to each other, I can see the difference, but not... If you just showed me some gameplay and was like, what's the frame rate?
Sometimes I can't even see the difference then. Like, okay, Gojo. Like, nice. You got it. You can see.
Okay, Gojo.
But, like, yeah, frame rate consistency, like, important. I agree. That's important.
Yeah.
And I also thought, not to again talk about yelling IGN man, but he called out Vampire Survivors as being like polished, which like I love Vampire Survivors, but like the frame rate on that game, like atrocious. Once there's a ton of stuff on screen, it's like stuttering, it's terrible. It makes me feel powerful. I'm like, I am so powerful, the game can't even run. But like polished, unclear. Anyway. So a lot of what that comes from in a lot of these situations is issues with shaders. Again, Madelyn doesn't really know what gaming terms mean. I might have to go back and listen to that podcast we did where we learned about gaming terms.
Sure. I don't know if we talked about shaders, but
I don't think we did, and that's why I don't know what it means. Very simply,
it's like the effects that are applied to 3D models.
So games have a lot of shaders. Basically. I think of this as them having colored pencils that they literally use to draw
sorta
game. No, it's not like that. Let's not patronize me. It's not like the game pulling out a colored pencil.
No, but it is also, a lot of shaders are like the real-time processing as well. So like the lighting effects of like when you walk through a light, the light hitting the 3D model appropriately and lighting it, for example.
So the issue is that in Unreal Engine 4, I have no idea if Unreal Engine 5 has fixed this. Maybe someone at Unreal has fixed this and everyone is just like, I don't want to pay to upgrade, we're going to stick with 4. But is that when whenever the game needs to use a shader that it hasn't used yet, it has to like go into the Crayola box and find it, basically. And so that leads to some stuttering as it loads that. And so your options a lot of the time are deal with that. And so your player is going to get a bunch of stuttering at the beginning of their play session, but hopefully it'll improve as they go on, unless you're just using a new shader every minute, in which case, Or you could have like a big long loading thing, like when the player opens the game. Or like people, I saw some articles whining about like whenever there's a new Call of Duty patch, you have to download all the shaders and it takes 15 minutes and like wah, right? Part of the problem here is that the solutions to some of these things are also things that PC gamers want to whine about.
Yes.
But I was reading about how Hi-Fi Rush came out pretty polished on PC, because this seemed like a basic thing to me. I was like, this seems like an easy way to like fix this. Is that they found a way to like load shaders before you needed them. It's like, okay, that seems like the solution. Why isn't everybody doing that? And presumably because it's harder than that. But it's fascinating to me. Like, that's not really, like, I don't understand. When games like stutter, I'm like, it's working hard. It's having a hard time. Like, my computer, I usually it's my computer. I'm like, my computer working too hard. I don't usually think like the game can't find the right crayon.
Sure. I think that might be a difference between like playing on your Mac versus having like a high-end PC that you
Okay, I think even if I had a high-end PC, I would still think, oh, my computer working too hard.
Okay, but I think before we get to that, there was one article that I thought was fun on like maybe polish isn't all it's cracked up to be anyway, and this is sort of a good transition to my last point. But I like this article of like, Would Bethesda's games be as, like, Bethesda is a really good example, I think, which is why I'm pulling it out. Would Bethesda's games be as iconic if they didn't have the bugs? You know? Setting aside, like, Fallout 76 or whatever. If you played, you know, you watch so many, like, Morrowind and Skyrim and Oblivion clips of just, like, random bugs and nonsense happening, and, like, that's delightful.
Long-time listeners may remember that one time I got trapped in an underwater cave in Skyrim. Like, the water didn't load in right. It was scary.
Yeah.
But very memorable.
Yeah. And do I find it delightful when Gail from camp sends me the invisible thumbs up? Yes.
She does.
I do.
I still think you're going to discover in Act 3 that he's got an actual bug on you.
I'm just lucky so far it's just been approvals. He hasn't disapproved of anything from afar. He hasn't sent me any thumbs down emojis.
Yeah.
Via magical text. So there's a certain amount to be said for, not broken releases, but there's a certain amount to be said for the fun of a good bug,
Yeah, it's tough, right? We could do a whole parallel podcast to this on jank, and I just might at one point. Every episode I have to talk about trying, right? An optimized trying would be awful. Like a polished trying would be bad. I actually don't. 4 is kind of like that, and I'm like, I actually don't like this as much as the ones that are less polished, because it's silly, and I like the silliness. And like that article has a really lovely video in it where like the woman's like, I don't know, like I won't always be watching you, and then she walks away and like bends at the waist backwards at a 90-degree angle and like continues to watch you as she walks away. And it's like, that's funny. And that's like also very much, even if that literally wouldn't happen, that's like very much sometimes what playing D&D with your friends can like feel like. Somebody does something really stupid that doesn't make sense, and you're like, oh, haha, like that's funny, we haha. But it's just really pretty much like, as much as it might be impossible to predict what gamers are going to decide is polished and what is not, I think it's even harder to predict what kind of bug or what kind of jank gamers are going to find beloved and what kind is going to be like, you're horrible. So like even in super polished Tears of the Kingdom, right? Everybody loved that item duplication glitch until they took it away, right? And you might point to that and say, well, that's not polished. That's a glitch that everyone was talking about and using and exploiting the game. If the game was polished, that wouldn't be there. But everybody loved it. Probably partially because it's like, haha, we beat Nintendo. Yeah. And then they took it away. Or, like you said, literally everything about Skyrim, right? Who knows? Like, Skyrim could still be a good game if it was polished. I don't know. It's hard to know.
Yes.
Because it's so core to what it is. Or, any of, like Generation 1 Pokemon. Like, everybody loves Missing No. Everyone loves the item duplication glitches, actually. You can probably predict that, like, those are going to be beloved. That's jank. You don't have to polish item duplication out. People like that.
I mean, there's what is speedrunning, but appreciating the glitches in games. Yeah.
Well, glitchless categories. So
sure.
But it's impossible to really predict that. It's even more than predicting like, what do I need to polish so people will think things are polished. It's even harder to predict what shouldn't I polish because people are gonna love that this has some rough edges.
Yeah. Anyway, that article is Patricia Hernandez on Inverse, which is In Defense of Video Game Jank, if you want to check it out, listeners. But this is sort of my last point of, I don't think polish necessarily means good. Mm-hmm. Because a game that's rougher can sometimes be more interesting to players. So I thought of a few examples, some of which sort of like response at large, some of which just personal to me. But I thought Three Houses versus Engage in Fire Emblem. Engage, I loved both these games, I feel like I should say, but Engage, infinitely the more polished experience. But Three Houses, much more enduring fandom presence. Despite its jank, right? Despite its issues of like, it is very much endured in the public consciousness more than Engage has, despite that being like a smoother, cleaner experience, I guess.
Engage also notably much more in line with like the long-running history of Fire Emblem too, right? Just to tie back that polished thread to like experience making it.
I played the Caligula Effect 2 last year or 2 years ago or something, which is definitely not as polished as the Persona games that it takes very clear inspiration from. But there's a lot of things in the Caligula Effect 2 that I liked more than the way they are in Persona, which I wrote a blog about and probably talked about on the podcast. But there's no doubt Persona is the more polished series. And it's not like, oh, Persona's worse than the Clicker Effect 2. I'm just saying, like, there's sort of this janky version that has a lot of stuff to love, and then Persona, which is clearly the more polished one, and is maybe a little bloated. Just maybe.
Maybe.
Okay, just throwing out a little criticism out there. Just throwing it out to be cheeky.
What are you talking about, Emma? We need a whole other semester.
And then, I haven't played Final Fantasy 16 yet, but 15, which of course came out not polished or complete, you could say, but it's much more interesting to me. I still find it much more interesting in its myriad of systems than 16, which definitely looks more like a more polished game, right? So just a couple of examples from me of, like, things can be polished even if you don't like them or don't think that they are good, because I think that polish is, like, a more, I don't like saying that, like, good is subjective, because I feel like some people take that too far to be like, you can't say things are good or bad because it's just, like, your taste or not, which is not true. But I feel like polish is a more objective category than, like, goodness.
Yeah.
Because polish doesn't really have to do with the fundamental design decisions at the core of a work. And it's those fundamental design decisions that are going to decide whether your game is good or bad. It's just the polish makes it easier for more players to see the good or bad core in there. And also, if you have a fancy enough UI menu, maybe it doesn't even matter if it's good or bad.
Or, like, style, right?
Yeah.
Coherent style.
Yeah.
No, I think, this is not to torture our metaphor here a little bit, right? Maybe what you're not really doing is polishing, but you're, like, sanding, right? And it's good if you're building things to, working with wood to, like, sand things down. Because people getting splinters and having, like, weird jagged edges and stuff is, like, bad, right? That's bad. That would hurt people. But in that sanding process, you can also lose some of the character or some of the things that would stick around or hold people's attention or make something stand out. And so there's always a risk of, there's not really a risk of over-polishing necessarily in that way in games. Like, if a game is good, it's probably still going to be good in that sense. Yeah. But you might lose some of the character, or it might just be a little bit less enduring. Fortunately, that's not really something we need to worry about too much as an industry at this point. Probably you should just work on having some time to do it.
Yeah.
And then you can worry about if you're polishing out all the character.
Yes. That's our advice, our patented Talk This advice.
Our Talk This advice is you worry about if you made your game run too smooth. You worry about if you need to add some jank back in later. Right? You worry about if you got to do that, like, fake loading screen thing later, right?
Yeah.
You get to that point first, and then you can decide if you want to take the risk on some jank. If you're like most of the industry, probably what you're hoping is that you're sanding down the right things in the time that you have, and that the things that you didn't get to are going to be things that people find charming and not, cyberpunk.
I want some more stylistic loading screens. The artistic choice.
This is the polish Emma wants.
Of using loading screens in your game. Because now it's a choice now, You don't have to have them anymore. But perhaps you want them.
Yeah, perhaps I want a moment to check my texts.
I want the lore. Put your little lore facts on your loading screen for me.
I'm not going to read it in a book, but I will on the loading screen.
Yes. Yeah.
It is funny. This will be my last point. But, we've talked so much about polish in the context of bugs. But, like, you can also definitely get away with a lot of stuff with style and with cohesion.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
So, maybe you've just got to throw a tablecloth on it.
All right.
Well, listeners, did you feel like this podcast was polished enough for you? Probably not. How would you define polish? I think part of the reason it's easier to talk about like polish as objective than good or bad as objective is because polish is only like mostly impossible to define.
Yeah.
So we got like a little bit to hang on to there. What's the most polished game you've ever experienced? Are you, like me, a little bit immune to this debate because you never play a game within like 3 months of launch?
You're too smart, Mom. You're
Am
too
I?
smart for gamers.
I like it's just that I have an endless backlog because I insist on starting games for the podcast that like I often then stick with. So if you have thoughts on any of this or anything else we talked about this week, hit us up on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. Maybe don't hit us up if you want to yell about, if you like the yelly IGN guy can pass.
Yeah.
On that.
Yeah.
If you want to learn more about the show, check us out on our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can check out the games in the hat, read the various other pages on the website, check out our blog featuring long-running series, Clickbait Boyfriend, and Split Screen, and you can find on our website the most important thing, which you can also get from listening to me right now, which is how to subscribe. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Casts. Oh, I think I said Stitcher. There's no Stitcher anymore.
That's just Pandora now.
It's
double Pandora.
Double Pandora. Anyway, anywhere you can find podcasts, unless it's defunct, you should subscribe to Talk This. What if I announced now that Talk This has just been in early access this entire time? Talk This is still in early access.
Full release of Talk This coming soon.
Coming later.
At some point.
Probably a whole side quest on early access at some point. We mostly sidestepped that this week. Next week, we've got an old game and a new game, because it's the main episode of the show.
We're doing Skullgirls and Mask of the Rose.
Right. Skullgirls, an old game that has not come up for anyone. No one has talked about.
Mm-mm.
So look forward to that. And then in 2 weeks, it's already 6 weeks in gaming. That's impossible.
It's not.
I have to say, I'm contractually obligated to say that it's impossible every time I say 6 weeks in gaming. It's impossible.
I know.
It's a bug. Anytime we say 6 weeks in gaming, I have to say unbelievable. Time's passing. No matter where you are, I can hear you say it.
Yep.
Well, that's it for the show. Emma, do you have a polished or buggy outro for us?
This week, I hope you play a game so polished you can see your own reflection.